Mellon Podcast. Conversations with the real humans behind broadband networks, cybersecurity, and the future of communications. Brought to you by QA Cafe. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Epik Mellon Podcast. Conversations with real people in networking, where we try to remind everybody that we are humans too, even though we're the ones who are making your internet go. My name is Jason Walls from QA Cafe, and I have with me Michael Shaw from Axiros Americas. Or is it all one thing now? Yeah. Yeah, Axiros North America, yeah.
The end of Mexico.
Right. Cool. That's good to know. So I've had Gunther on the podcast previously, and the Axiros guys are all great guys, but I wanted to get Michael on the call because we've talked about everything, he and I. So
No, it's true, and it was really fun. That was a cool episode. I think it was the physicist and the philosopher, and I thought that was perfect. Because one of the things that we do like to focus on here is the science of what we do, and I think a lot of that kind of background informs the company culture and the decisions we make, and the way we see the world. Maybe is the thing that I find myself explaining to people sometimes, because we do look at everything as a problem to solve, and sometimes when people get too much into the jargon of esoteric kind of things that aren't easily defined, it makes
the things I have to pause for on the show and be like, explain what it is.
Yeah, so Gunther and I will get like headaches. And so we were talking one day at one of our conferences about this thing that we do with manual labor. So he'll shovel snow and I'll cut my yard, and there's once a week where I can do nothing but focus on manual labor, and I find it extremely satisfying.
Very important for your mind, like.
Almost in a state, in a neighborhood where you have to explain yourself if you cut your own yard, because everybody has people. There'll be a big truck will parachute in and 10 people will get out, and all this kind of high pitch, high frequency noise. But that's my time to sort out and shake things off.
Right. And this is my time. When I'm winging it is my meditative time.
That's great.
Why I do this show, because I just like. But before we do say anything along those lines, given that this podcast is brought to you by QA Cafe, the views expressed by myself or Michael do not reflect those of QA Cafe or its ownership, and the same goes with Axiros North America. So just to cover our asses a little bit before we dive into the things that we usually.
Yeah, no, for sure, and it's kind of nice to do that, and thanks for letting me wait so long to do this with you. I've been a fan of watching the podcast and how it's progressed, and how you seem to have a great time with this. And one of the things that's nice is to speak as individuals. I think both of us are called upon in our official capacity all the time to speak on behalf of our organizations or Broadband Forum, both of which we have some roles within. And you do measure yourself in a certain way to be topical, to represent the organization, the views, held thereby. So and I understand this is going to be a little bit more casual. We don't need to get salty, but
Here's the thing, though, Michael. Like I was talking to Massimo, who is the basically the founder of Z Factor, who does this show for us. And they do all of Broadband Forum's digital marketing. They do QA Cafe's digital marketing. And I had him on the show, and we were talking about the fact that people actually crave us being normal, and not business speak,
Yeah.
Like when you can address people like that, and like then all of a sudden, like half of the barriers go down,
Right. And you can ask any of my team. We have sort of a dogmatic mission to suppress jargon. Interestingly enough, and it's a funny thing how someone's journey. Mine's been fun and interesting, and at times challenging and awful. But back in the military, when I was in the United States Navy Reserve for a long time, there was a lot of jargon, but it was never the way people use business jargon. The jargon
Right.
that was used in the military was precise, specific, and it was sort of a language, much like you'd speak
Right.
in technical terms now. But what I found, because two of my interests are kind of science, technology, and business and economics, and together I think those two things sort of weave,
Economics.
that plus
We can talk
music.
about that on a whole
Yeah,
show by itself.
yeah, exactly. Well, to me, those are the things that make up the world, right? Music, economics, natural sciences, and that informs everything else, and that created society, and those are the things we all have in common. But in the military, jargon was used in large part as a common form of communication. In business and technology, it can be a form of obfuscation and bullshittery.
Yes. Right.
And I
Right.
hate it. I
Isn't
hate
that
it.
funny?
And it's
Isn't
not
that funny?
helpful particularly.
No, not really at all. It's like I don't know. It's so my wife has a mobile catering company that serves alcohol, right? So it's a mobile bar. And so she's sort of navigating the state in a lot of ways for the first time. And it's like half of her skill set now is now that, right? But the interesting thing to me is the number of people, and this happens in big companies, right? Is that it's like any bureaucracy, you have sort of this layer of everyone trying to like there's a layer of everyone trying to appease the lawyers and cover their own ass, right? Like and you can see when people are doing that rather than being humans,
Right, right.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think that there's so I had an interesting conversation with my daughter last night, and she's in her first year of law school, and she was asking me about mediation, and I said, "Oh, that's because they're doing contracts now," and so I kind of explained how that works, and as oftentimes in business, you can understand a little bit about the culture of the company you're working with based upon the kind of you know contractual obligations they want to try to force or enforce. And if there's a mediation clause, that's often a good sign. It means that they
Yeah.
want to take nuclear options off the table.
Oh,
And
that's
so
good.
you'd say maybe they were acting in good faith, kind of entering in the relationship. Whereas if there isn't, or if they object to it, they might go more quickly to a nuclear option. And I just think it's kind of interesting. I do think the world, generally speaking, is made up of people who want clear talk and understanding and communication, and then some, whether it's their own decision or otherwise, take more sort of a doctrinal type of approach in everything they
Yeah,
do.
yeah.
And I think
And
work
so
relationships
you
shape how
you
people
you
act after
encounter
hours.
that.
What's that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. They absolutely do, right? And
Yeah, yeah. So I think the
but you
culture of an organization, the culture of a team, the culture of society, those things that I think are all affected by the behaviors that are practiced most. And so if you see things creeping in that aren't healthy, flesh them out of your life, of your business, of your interactions.
yeah.
You know, just ugh.
So tell me, how is it that you have gained such wisdom? How
Oh,
did you get into
making a
being
lot of
where you are
mistakes.
now?
Making a lot of mistakes. I don't know that I don't know too many people that have insights. And by the way, I'm right or wrong. I'm right for me. And the people I interact with seem to like it okay. But I think that there are really two ways that people learn best. And I'm a big believer in mentorship and mentoring,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you can be a mentoree, and a mentor at the same time. But the point is, and that was the other thing that being in the Navy Reserve, and then a little bit of time on active duty trained me, and it is that our national military institutions have a very historic, successful way of training people
Uh-huh.
to always be looking for the next job up. and to fill in. And I think that experience, which happened early in my business career, was very informative, because before that, when I look back now, all of the formal education that I've had, I was usually being trained to understand the subject matter. What I
Right.
what I don't think formal education really does, outside of, like, law school has moot court, and there are labs and stuff in some certain science areas, and there's collaborations in certain computer science areas. So those things accepted, but not to say that all those are positive. But I think it's subject matter training for the most part. And what the military really taught me was, you have to not only know your job but everyone else's, and then you have to understand the context. And so things like situational awareness applied to the greater world and the business world gives all the roles more meaning. And
Right,
that
right,
gives
right, right.
the data and the information that informs decisions more context and more meaning. And so
Right.
I think in a roundabout way, it was a combination of you know science education, business education, and that military experience that really helped me organize the understanding of how to apply
Mhm.
knowledge. And
What was that science education?
yeah, I had an interesting, non-traditional educational path, but it started out with a traditional liberal sciences education
Yeah.
that was interrupted with an entrepreneurial streak. So early,
You don't say.
yeah, a couple of years into school, and I wasn't trying to follow, I don't know, Zuckerberg might not have even been born, but I didn't have a business model where I was going to go through 2 years of school and then start a business. But that's what happened. I was good at a couple of things, and I ended up becoming a stockbroker, and I was analyzing, of all things, waste
No
management
way.
stock. Yeah, before I graduated, and that was maybe this was in the mid to later 80s, and so it was sort of an intoxicating, flattering sort of thing to have asked.
How how the heck did you get into broadband?
Well, that's actually an interesting story too, but I'll make that jump, because what happened is I got into investment stuff and was analyzing stocks, and then our firm was sort of boutique. One of our clients was Dwight Gooden from the New York Yankees, and Darryl Strawberry and a couple of the people. They're all great players. They all ended up having, like, drug problems. So I don't know if that was great, but but alleged drug problems. I'm not sure how those things all ended up, but they were really nice guys, and I had a bunch of autographed baseballs. But so we would do institutional research for portfolios like that, and I became fascinated by economics, and how it applies different industries, right? And so it was one of the first things that caused me to sort of start looking outward from the perspective of economics, and I found that meshed really well with how some of my early science education was causing me to only look outward and past the atmosphere. When I joined the Navy Reserves, and then used a part of the GI Bill to finish my undergraduate degree, I went into a program that was accelerated. It was sort of designed on a British model that really was a combination of independent study and intensives throughout the year that were you were going to be doing that for 24 hours a day for 2 weeks, on campus, and then followed by independent study, and it's all or nothing. Like, you pass it or you fail it.
Mhm.
And it was insane, really, to think about now that I wanted to do that, but I did. And so I was introduced to the option of being able to create some facets of a traditional liberal arts degree, taking a la carte pieces of 15 credit hour blocks and putting them together. And it ended up that a lot of my undergraduate degree ended up being focused on natural sciences. But the problem was there were some offerings that were astrophysics is what it's called now, but it was astronomy, and so from the physics and astrophysics departments of UF and FIU, I think it was, came together and did several seminars, and it was really then that back in the day I was fascinated with space, and I did a lot of my undergraduate work was focused on black holes, if you can believe it.
No way.
Yeah. And so when I finished, I had an appreciation for all of the things that were involved in what some might say has nothing to do with what we do here on Earth. But I'd also had
no wonder you and Gunter get along so well.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I also had a great foundation in the humanities too, and so letters is all these archaic ancient terms that people, but letters was the other focus, and so civilization was the other part of it. So then later, after I had an entrepreneurial stint, and then business school, and then economics for graduate school. I was able to put together, I think, ingredients of, different factors that gave me a really well-rounded perspective. Civilizations are born of, looking to the stars, seeking understanding, having an explorer's imagination, beautiful music, appreciation of art, the need to create, the need to organize, the need to lead, the need to, create a place for everybody. And so I actually think that all of those things were big factors in who I am now and how I look at things. And that's changed over time, but by and large, how I got into broadband was after my first entrepreneurial stint, I was asked by a company called Itochu, ITOCHU, which at the time we used to joke was the biggest or third largest company in the world based on whatever the valuation of the yen was at the time. But they bought, they wanted to buy, I think it was 4 or 5 U.S.-based telecommunications companies. Oh. And so by then I had done a little bit of time in finance. I worked with Boone Pickens for a while on his United Shareholders Association stuff when he was, as he used to call it, he was drilling for oil on Wall Street. So if you might be too young to remember, but Boone Pickens was one of the originators of going and taking poorly managed oil companies and buying all their shares, and said, if you're not going to drill those fields, I'll just buy your company. And his little Mesa Petroleum out of Amarillo, Texas at the time. But I learned a lot from Boone Pickens as far as, there's good management's important, but also thinking outside the box. That was totally outside the box. But I was intoxicated by the possible, right? So he was a geologist who started a company called Mesa Petroleum, and he was taking on one of his first big ones that made him famous in that space was golf. Which was 10 or 20 times the size of Mesa. So after that, I really started to become interested in business. And so when Atoshu and I ended up kind of meeting, Atoshu's not a person but a company, but they invited me to come on board, and I was one of I was going to say whiz kids, but it wasn't like that. I was fortunate enough to be part of this effort to purchase 5 companies in the United States, because they had done a joint venture with Scientific Atlanta and Time Warner and a few others that went very well in Japan. And so they wanted to invest in some US-based distributors, companies, and that kind of thing. And so that's what got me into broadband. And then, as you kind of know, it's like the mafia. Once you're in, it's, you never really leave, it becomes part of who you are. I don't know why that
That
is, but
that happens to be the unsaid fourth subject of this show.
yeah, I think it's the fact that we
Just when
think we.
you think you're out.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder, what it is. First of all, I'll say I like the people. With only a few exceptions, I really think that the industries at the time I came in. So in the this would have been we made those acquisitions in the late, mid to late 80s and leading into kind of the early 90s, and there was still sort of a wildcatter type of mentality that was just burning out. It was businesses were really starting to transform into serious operations. The cable operators, the MSOs,
Right.
as they were all called at the time.
They were, yeah.
They were consolidating. They were becoming larger, more sophisticated, with all the things that requires, right? Encrypted set-top boxes. That was a thing for a while. Where that was,
Right.
that was one of the first big advancements that I think really got me familiar with companies like General Instruments, which became Motorola, which for a time was run by Donald Rumsfeld, which was fascinating. Ted Turner was starting Cable News Network, which everybody thought was bananas, right? And that turned out to change the nature of news coverage. And a lot of those operators were still really sort of very independent minded. And I liked that whole atmosphere. I didn't like all of it, but I liked a lot of it.
Yeah.
What I liked was the
Right.
ongoing transformation. And I see that.
So you were around during like the Rusbe Yassini days, and like when packet cable first became a thing, right? And they were suddenly being, and the very concept of broadband was coming to be, right? Like,
right.
yeah.
And
For these companies, I mean,
yeah. And so in the space where I was working, it was predominantly, HFC, hybrid fiber coax. So the technology was evolving and reaching larger service areas for them meant, putting up cable and putting out, optical nodes and then doing coaxial drops. But at the same time, back at the head end, one of the companies that Atoshi bought was a manufacturer that did digital head ends, and so there really was satellite signals coming down and aggregated content, and then delivery through these pipelines. Every facet of that signal chain was evolving. And so even within the general area of that industry, you could have people that would sort of highly specialize. And it was the thing that maybe I found most interesting is it really was impossible to master every one of the things that were evolving very quickly. So wherever you were, if you think of sort of orbiting, objects, orbiting satellites around a fixed, massive object, that industry, everybody had kind of their own orbit and their area of expertise.
Right.
And it required them to interact and to cooperate, collaborate.
Big time. Right. And now, I mean, it's one of the questions I've always had, because I've never really been able to talk to anyone in depth about who has been on the cable side of things so intensely for that time. But like, in addition to the fact that like the individual people within there all had their own culture and language and expectations and expertise.
Yeah.
Now you're dealing with the fact that effectively cable and telcos are the same thing, but that wasn't that long ago, and so everybody involved in those industries are still those different people.
Right. Well, I'll tell you a funny story. So, because on the cable side, we'll just say that we're using ancient languages, Jason.
It is ancient language, isn't that crazy?
On the cable side, the standards bodies that you worked with, the SCTE, the Society of Cable Telecommunications Engineers, as it was then known, and Cable Labs were sort of the equivalent, say, of what might be the Broadband Forum now. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago where I understood that used to be the DSL Forum. I go like, oh, what? DSL.
And the ATM forum before that, you want to get super specific.
Yeah, that's funny. So,
Isn't that crazy?
it is kind of, yeah, yeah. And now it's not about the how at all. I mean, only in the most uh, abstract way, because there is always now, and what I've really enjoyed about this year's sort of cycle of forums and symposiums and blah 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 is the fact that now, starting last year, maybe the fourth quarter of last year, I've seen a real increase in the quality of events where there will be people that have technology, and there will be operators from and that use everything from fixed wireless to still have some cable or HFC plant. They might even have some copper plant still. They're laying fiber, and they're looking at the delivery mechanism really as a means to an end. Everything is just about the content and the customer experience. And so they all have that customer experience and content delivery and business viability in mind, but they have to, in often cases, know so much about all these legacy technologies, and take the decision whether to overbuild themselves, or how much needs to be plowed under, how much doesn't. But they also have the regulatory folks alongside, on panels, presenting what's coming up in regulations, so that it's demystified in a lot of ways. The information to be successful and compliant is much more available. And I'm also starting to see equity, private or public, represented in these forums, and expositions to sort of give a full picture. Coming back around to what we were talking about earlier, is none of these things that contribute to society happen in a vacuum. No pun intended for a space analogy, but it takes all those things. And, right. And everybody kind of understands that now. And that wasn't always the case. There was a lot of us against them type things in different industries. Yeah. But I think in broadband delivery, it's not like that so much. They're all in it together. And I see a lot of collaboration.
Yeah. No, that is really, really healthy. And it's especially good because now, like, at least on the regulation side, they're not like, they're not trying to operate in a vacuum ahead of time, and them being like, surprise, here's what.
Yeah. And they're not, they're not immune, and neither do they seem to go out of their way to resist feedback, because by putting themselves out there. I went to a really interesting one mid-year, where there was some, there was some disclosure of some programs that were timing out, that were going to have real impact on a lot of the operators, because some of their users, their customers, were going to be having a subsidy removed. And even those terms in today's age sound can incite different sorts of emotional or business responses. But what was interesting was that they were all looking at it as things were going to be more difficult for some of their users to avail themselves of the service that they were delivering. And so, in a lot of ways, society is kind of evolving. Talking about economic models, I don't think this is so much a matter of grain subsidies, where someone has to make moonshine or gasoline additives because of a farm lobby or something. They're working together with programs that are meant to uplift people, to be able to be connected to the modern world through broadband, and they're looking at it as having a business effect if it's taken away. Understanding that since early, maybe 2018-19, some of these government funded initiatives really have bridged the digital divide for lots of people in rural communities, And everybody is kind of dealing with that and looking at that both as an opportunity, but also, I think, a little bit as an obligation. And I remember the first time 5 years ago when I saw the broadband coverage map in the United States, I was a little embarrassed. I was a little surprised.
Yeah. Well, and I forgive it because we're huge, right? It's the same thing when people are like, I can't believe the United States doesn't have, you know, cross-country public transportation. And I'm like, do you know how big this place is?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and so for that reason, I feel like it's really interesting. I think So if you and I were both asked independently, separately, and without corroboration, um, or collusion beforehand, we'd say this is a really interesting industry, and we've never been bored. There's always, if you are it, do something else because
No, and I find that crazy for me too, because it's like obviously I do a I do a lot of different things at QA Cafe, right? And we straddle two different industries entirely, right? Because on the CloudShark side of things, it's entirely enterprise networking and stuff like that, and then on the broadband side of things, it's on the CD router side of things, it's broadband. But in large part, a good part of my career is hinged on device management and tier 69 and all that, right? And like, but even the fact that I've been doing that for 20 years, it's never got boring,
right. Yeah,
you know.
and I think that's great. And by the way, one of the things I love about you doing the podcast is um, a lot of people have a need to express themselves creatively in a lot of ways. I think
Exactly.
where a workplace can allow for that, that's great. And where it doesn't, there you can do things, right. You can compose music, you can play music, all those kind of things. You kind of have a nice balance of both because you're able to bring a lot of the creativity that you have personally into both roles that you fulfill with QA Cafe, and that's fantastic. And then you have these outside creative pursuits. I really believe that the holistic kind of individual is one of the more productive ones, and and um,
Absolutely.
and I don't think it needs to be that people are discontent to the degree that they always have to be engaged in something. Sometimes it's those pursuits that are just using different parts of your brain. Um,
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah.
and I
It's like
found.
mowing, like you said, mowing the lawn, right? Like,
Right. Yeah, and one of the team members here is funny. He's an enigma, really, in a really fun, fascinating way. He loves music. He's deeply skilled in the things he does. With Axiros North America. He plays golf, but doesn't look like a golfer. But he's doing everything you can possibly imagine to make himself better at doing it, but not to the extent that it's going to prevent him from getting this crazy looking, smoker barbecue barrel shape. And I just learned the most interesting things about people in our space, where I think it's more common in technology that people have interesting or weird hobbies. I've met people who
yeah.
make absinthe. Like, really? Tell me more about that. And they will understand the entire history of absinthe. And it's interesting. Another person who
It's
made
crazy.
made chocolate,
Yeah.
and I said, well, I do too. I'll go get a Hershey. He goes, no, 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 man. I import cocoa beans and I roast them, and I roast some like this. And I go, okay, I need to know more about why you do that. Um, and I find that kind of stuff fascinating, right? And
No, absolutely. Right.
it's
Yeah.
more often the case than not. I mean, I don't
No,
know
it
too
totally
many
is.
people
Yeah.
without hobbies. Do you?
Well, yeah, no, you're right. It's like outside. I mean, obviously we have some selection bias, but yeah, it's totally true. And I also think that like it's like you were saying, it's like our industry is conducive to that personality type, right? Because I find the thing that I love about networking in our industry is that it's almost like, and I don't know if this is just a recent development or if this has always been the case, but especially when it comes to um, at least in like the home network engineering teams, or just just some of these engineering teams, they're pretty scrappy, right? They're pretty scrappy, even though they're a part of a giant company. Their team is pretty scrappy, right? And you need scrappy people to do those jobs, and that's the kind of people that have those creative pursuits. It's like I was talking to Matt Langlois here when I had him on the show, because he is super into high end audio, right? Like goes out of his way to get
Oh
like
yeah,
special
no.
components
Oh,
and
are we
fix up old
talking
amps
about,
and all that stuff.
tubes and you know
Yep.
multiple
Yep.
speakers in a cabinet? That one does this
Oh
frequency
yeah.
range, and okay.
Yeah. And so, but we were talking about how you have it's almost like it's like a special kind of daemon that you have, like that gives you the drive to do those things. And I talk about Lincoln a lot on this show too, even though I've never had him on. We kind of had a joke that he's a mythological person that I made up, but Lincoln's the same
Is
way,
he
right?
actually
Like,
real? Because
it,
has there actually been a sighting?
yeah, you should see the rig he has. He actually built an all analog audio system. So from the record player to the amplifier that is made of vacuum tubes, all the way to the speaker system is analog 100%.
Oh, that's awesome. No, I love it. I can appreciate audio files. So I play bass. There's a couple here, but the whole tube versus transistor thing, and and why does the human brain appreciate the sound of tube audio versus transistor audio? That's a taste great, less filling thing, and some people can
I
understand.
didn't know though. I didn't know until I heard it,
Oh
right?
yeah,
And so and I realized that this is digitally mixed in the first place, so it's not exactly the same effect. But Lincoln was playing like I think the Matrix 2 soundtrack, right, on an LP through this system, and I was like, I've never heard this before. Like I've never heard this before.
yeah. Is someone hitting a triangle in the
Yeah,
background there?
it's
Yeah,
so
yeah.
funny.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Audiophiles I find fascinating. I feel bad though. It's kind of a sickness if if you've got the bug bad. But that's the thing, right? It's not wasted pursuit because it's so creative and interesting. The other thing is, there is a creator mentality, I think, in a lot of and I think the most healthy, vibrant, growing industries, there is a creator personality, and oftentimes for a creator personality to flourish, they have to feed so much input that may not always be it may not always be apparent that it is applicable to their professional pursuits. But so I'm absolutely sure his understanding of audio and signal processing, and of distortion, you know, uh, are going to add, if only in the most minor way, to his ability to communicate something to somebody, to implement a technology, having gone through the trials and tribulations of creating to help train people how to think. So I
Mhm.
love that kind of stuff. And by the way, keeping ancient technologies alive, I think that's interesting because it's the origin of a lot of this stuff. Analog audio is fascinating, and by the way, still thriving. There's big factories that are making these vacuum tubes or
Oh
valves.
yeah, right.
So
It's like
that's
thank goodness for nostalgia.
yeah, yeah, and it's in a lot of ways, I think there's a in in the U.S. for sure, and maybe around the world. One of the things that I do think would help civilization, especially in trying times like this, I do think that there is a certain amount of attention, or I won't say reverence, but familiarity with the past that is necessary to provide context to present times. So attempts to sort of eliminate the teaching of history, good and bad, is bad. I think local history is important. Global history, particularly now, is important. Geopolitics, and I'll say science and economics. So arts, science, economics, those are the fabrics of civilization. And I think we don't spend a lot of time creating people, potential workers with such a broad context. And I think that would really help. And I'm not being critical.
And
of
I think,
anybody
I
that
think
has a
it starts
specialty.
with celebrating it, right? Like telling people that it's okay, right? And that's part of my point of trying to do all this stuff, right? It's like, because what I want to know about people is those things, right?
Yeah.
I want people who, I remember back when I used to work at UNH at the interoperability lab, when we were hiring kids, we would ask them, I would always ask this very specific question. I'd be like, tell me about a project that you did on your own. You didn't have to do it. It wasn't for work. It wasn't for school. Something that you did on your own to completion, right?
Got
Because
it.
that reveals whether or not they have the spirit, right? Because
Yeah.
they'll be like, oh yeah, and it could be about anything. I don't care what it is, right? Like I play Dungeons and Dragons once a week, right? I will tell you about an entire campaign that I wrote up, right? But like the possessing the desire to dive into something like that, and the wherewithal to be like, I'm not leaving this until it's done, right? I'm gonna wake up at 2 a.m. and have an idea about this, and I'm gonna get up and go work on it, you know?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's not for everybody, but there's so much that is interesting in the world that I think intense focus. I go back and forth on whether I think national service ought to be something that is woven into the requirements of citizenship, and I'm not dogmatic about it, and the whys and wherefores. It's kind of understanding, because there are arguments on both sides, but I do think that there's a lot about appreciating what you're doing, where and why, and what happened in the past, and what's potentially possible in the future, that can be myopic if it's focused only inward, and dangerous if it's not focused outward too. And that's a big that's a big request of society. But I think it's very important, and so for the same reasons that when I was going to school, we were forced to learn a foreign language versus, say, a computer language. And my daughter took Spanish forever. I think she even did a preschool thing, but the point was that by the time she was learning at the college level, they should have, in my opinion, offered a computer language as an alternative to a foreign language, simply because it helps that sort of creator type of personality be discovered. It might reveal some insights they may never use, or may change the trajectory of their life altogether. But if they spend a semester in Spain, and they went to Barcelona and had a great time, and they got to speak some Spanish, is that more valuable on the whole than learning a computer language? I think they're both important. I think cultural exchanges is important. I think all those things, but the fact that most schools, even in liberal arts education, are dogmatically opposed to allowing students to take a computer programming language in lieu of a foreign language is a shame.
Yeah, even if you're not even in that field, right? Because it teaches you, it's exactly what you said, right? It will suddenly reveal to you things about yourself.
Right. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm all for I kind of like the concept of liberal arts educations for undergraduate and graduate for specialization, but higher education in the United States, I think, needs sort of an overhaul anyway. I've now had so much exposure to sort of the British model of education that they can compress, a lot into 3 years versus 4, and it would leave the fourth for a specialization. And I actually think that's a good model.
And not for nothing, I actually have a very similar opinion about middle school. Like, I don't think it should exist. It's like kids should totally skip those years and do whatever the hell they want, because they're gonna find a lot of that when they're like 11, 12. Like,
That's a really interesting concept. Like, could
12,
you
13. Yeah.
could you start college at 15? If you were to eliminate middle school, which, quite frankly, let's be honest, is just when you learn how to survive among potentially
No, no, right, right.
odd and psychopathic personality types.
Right, right. That's half of the reason, right? Like, let's just let them miss out on all that trauma. And
Yeah, that's interesting. I like that.
yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
I'd like to see you running, for office on that one day. I think that's.
Oh man. I entrepreneurial spirit, right? I've
Yeah,
I've come
yeah,
to the realization that the best way to make change is to just do things. I learned this from my wife too,
yeah,
right? The best way to make change is to just do stuff.
yeah.
And so
That's.
I would just start a school and be like, especially New Hampshire, because the homeschooling laws are very loose. So you could just you just hand in a folder once a year that says what you did. So you could start a school that's like, here's your middle school, right? Go play, and then write up the things that you learned for 3 years, and then you're
You've just actually introduced a very important element of company culture, right? Long ago I learned that there is a terrible, terrible mistake to make a loud, certain proclamation of what we're going to do and how it's going to be done. The better way is to have a plan, sure, to be open to making modifications and improvements, but then it's the doing that creates the fulfillment, for the people involved, and that ends up setting a culture of creativity and the positive outcomes. Whereas sometimes people and companies will, and organizations and governments and every type of organized, human activity, if it starts with a proclamation that already, has an outcome that is to be achieved, with maybe the possible exception of, the American moon landing, the Apollo project, that one worked out
right.
fine.
Yeah, yeah.
But otherwise, most of the time, having sort of a grand proclamation that everybody's marching to is just ignored, because they get busy
No, it
with
really,
the
and it doesn't
doing.
last very long at all, right?
It doesn't
So
seem
it's like,
important
I
a
don't know.
weekend.
Right, 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 right.
Yeah.
And you might put a lot of effort into crafting what that is, right? My
Right.
favorite. So I've been reading this book called Alchemy from Rory Sutherland. He's the guy who founded. He's one of the founders of Ogilvy, like the biggest ad agency in the world. And the whole thing is about
I'm nodding, but I
it's
didn't know
it.
that. But I'm hearing you. That's
He's right, yeah, yeah, yeah. So the whole book is about like not ignoring the planners, but like valuing the irrational. And that's one of the things he talks about is how most of the things that have made it have been totally crazy.
absolutely.
Most of the things that we use, right? My favorite, one of my favorite examples, um, is he talks about the sandwich, right? And it's like the Earl of Sandwich was not a normal person, right? He
Absolutely.
was he was a weirdo that didn't want to stop eating while he was playing poker because he was addicted to eating and gambling. But now it is the most successful food product of all time. So
Yeah. And there you go. And so if you had preconceived notions about diet and convention,
right. Well, if you made that big proclamation, there's a chapter of the book called, well, it works in practice, but does it work in theory?
well, and I think that so many of those things, oh, the look, kind of like the best technology is invisible. sometimes the biggest successes are the most unlikely, right?
Mhm.
I remember one of the things that had a lasting impression on me from business school was there were two. So the aside from other things, one of the arrows in the quiver, most of the arrows in the quiver are case studies, right? It's you're studying successes and failures. Oftentimes, it's just transferring knowledge about how things can be measured and the way it's been done. So your mention of Ogilvy kind of reminded me of this. I remember there was a case study that went into great detail. I mean, one might say painful detail about how to market toothbrushes. And by the way,
Mhm.
I'm sure it's out there. I think it was Colgate or one of the primary manufacturers of toothpaste and toothbrushes, and everything came down to all of the the study that went into how to market it, how to price it, fractional differences in pricing, shelf space, other types of promotion. For products that were very similar and different, had all different outcomes, and then they zeroed in and were widely successful. And by that time, I'm so bored you can't even imagine, right? The other one was a case study of early to highly successful, mature Starbucks. And one would say that when Starbucks became a phenomenon, it had already been one by the time this case study was put together, but they didn't do anything that was conventional. Nothing.
Mhm.
From
And he
the
uses that as one of the examples, actually. He's like, imagine if you were like, I'm going to charge $6 for a cup of coffee.
the case study for Starbucks was one of the most fascinating and made the most lasting impression of a study in doing the unexpected um, in every respect that really made an impression on me because it was also providing insurance for part-time employees. It was
Oh, yeah, yeah.
how they were making fair trade agreements with growers directly and requiring that certain things were done to avoid ecological disasters in the future that would just one might say they were doing it for all the reasons that you do it to protect ecologically sensitive area. Other might be that out of self-interest they just
Offer
didn't want
supply,
their supply to get screwed up 10 years when
which is fine, which is
you
who
know
cares, right?
one of those kind of things where you can good companies act like companies, but sometimes the disruptors are the ones that
Mhm.
change how companies act. And when they're a winner, people study them, and that's what happened. And so there's a lot
Oh
of
yeah,
lessons still
I
there.
read that. There was another great Harvard Business Review um, article, one of my favorite ones that I read of all time. That was like, wait a minute, what if all of our case studies are survivor bias? Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's
right?
and at the time it was interesting to me, and I think that there's a place for misfits. There's a in business. There's a place for creative influences, and there's a case for technology, serious science. And
And look, all of us end up in networking.
yeah, well, and what's happening now more and more is space exploration too. So,
Mhm.
years ago, I got involved in some of the light sail projects with Planetary Society, and that also brought together a lot of different type of disciplines and personalities, and it was basically citizen funded, satellites powered, with solar sails. And that was a really interesting experience too, because people still have this need to explore. Businesses still need to run. Technology needs to advance, but the imagination has to be fostered, because the inspiration for creating an entirely different model for selling coffee, didn't come probably from business
Right.
school. It probably wasn't all economic driven. It was a combination of things. Even early Apple computer, and even now with the things that are happening with SpaceX, those are coming from what are sometimes scorned ideals of sort of a
Yeah.
multiplanetary society.
Well, I mean, look at our industry. Look at Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is like the biggest example of that. I mean, half of its
Absolutely.
success is totally by accident. Right?
Oh yeah, I can't tell you. My home was built in like 2006. I've got a wiring cabinet, and I've got all kinds of places for wired devices that haven't been used ever. You know, ever.
Right.
If they were made of copper, I'd pull them all out and smelt it into the Liberty Bell or something. So
Right.
yeah, Wi-Fi is a great example. And by the way, I think you might know from your talk with Gunther, that's kind of how he got involved in all of this. I think it like hurt his brain how people were approaching because that's a very good example of physics, right? So wireless technology is very, very rooted in science. Everything that physical law affects wireless performance, and that's how he saw that. The technology of connectivity and what it ultimately ended up doing in today's age. Think about the fascinating leap that was to get here. And I know the focus of your connected home council stuff, is largely rooted in the residents and in at the edge where people are taking the wireless signal and doing something with it, learning, communicating, running businesses, being entertained. That's a fascinating space that continues to evolve. I agree with you. That's a great example.
Exactly. And that's what makes it fun for me.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. So tell me how.
All right.
Can I
Yep.
ask you a couple questions?
Yeah, sure.
How'd you start the podcast? Tell me what, like, you're
Oh,
sitting down. There isn't one yet, and you say to yourself, "What?"
so I had the title of this, right, is Epic Mellon, and it comes from a portmanteau of uh oh man, now I can't remember. It's Greek. The Greek words effectively mean the future of communications. And when I was looking up the translation, I was like, oh, Epic Mellon, I have to name it that, right? But I had the idea for it years ago where I just wanted to talk about the stuff that I have to deal with every day. But I was like, it all comes down, it really comes down to the experience that I've had in the industry, right? Particularly through standards, but that's just because that's how I get out, right? I could be getting out through some other mechanism, out of the office and visiting people. But it caused me to realize that this fundamental thing that everybody needs and we all deal with has really wild characters behind it, right? And I enjoy hearing I want to know those human stories because I feel like that's knowing that we're all participating in making this invisible world that everybody needs go is fascinating to me, right? It's like my teenager says when she was a kid, she's like, my dad goes to bars to make rules for the internet. That's when she would tell people what my job is, right?
Not a bad description.
Oh, it's very accurate. Right. And so I was like, look, it's like here, it's all our customers at QA Cafe, all that stuff. Like, I was like, no, I just want to, I want people to hear our stories, because we're mavericks, we're scrappy cowboys and nerds. And that's why I like it.
That's cool. No, I really think it's neat. So I'm congratulations to you. I think it's a fun endeavor. Hopefully this will be interesting. And when we're taping this, there's a hurricane headed our way.
Well,
So
I was going to,
we
yeah,
made it in. We made it under
yeah.
the wire. I don't hear any trees falling yet, so that's good.
So it's supposed to hit you guys like pretty soon, like in the next 45 minutes or so.
Yeah, luckily so I'm in the Tampa Bay, Florida area, and it's going to pass by us about 140 miles to the west in the Gulf of Mexico, unless it decides to turn inland. But it's growing in strength and speed, and it's one of the disadvantages of living here. But it's hopefully. Hopefully everything will be fine here.
Also,
I'm at
hope
home
everything will be
today
fine.
I'm at home today as a direct result because the office in Tampa is 2 bridges away. and that wasn't happening. I think they closed the bridges early this morning, but it is going to hit somewhere. So by the time this airs, we'll probably be seeing, lots of people affected, and so I hope that all goes well. But I'm
Yes,
glad we got
I
this
hope
in.
everything goes safely. Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
And we were talking about it yesterday. I'd be like, will we be able to do this today? I don't know.
Listen, I'm glad we did it on kind of an interesting day, right? So
Yeah.
we can look back and say, yeah, we made this through the hurricane. But thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure.
No, thank you too. I really appreciate it. As always, please do subscribe to this YouTube channel so you can listen to all these things. Listen to some of the past ones. Listen to the Gunther interview, also at Axiros. It was really great, really great.
Thanks, Jason. Me too.
He's a character. And above all, own the nerdy things you love and have fun doing them. Thanks, Michael.
You too. Thanks, Jason.